On the surface, the Western Pacific looked calm. Gentle waves brushed against steel hull as the sea breeze carried the scent of salt across the deck of a lone destroyer. But tranquility shattered in an instant. A sharp electronic pulse lit up the radar scope, its crimson glow washing over tense faces inside the command center. Alarms howled through iron corridors. Boots hammered on metal grates. In seconds, routine watch turned into combat readiness. The signal was small, fragmented but insistent. Was it a reconnaissance drone, a probing fighter, or something darker waiting just beyond the horizon? The sailors knew the stakes. Every click of the radar sweep, every report shouted across the room, pushed them closer to a line no one wanted to cross. The silence of the ocean had transformed into a stage of peril. Inside that steel box, men and women gripped consoles with white knuckles. One wrong move, one premature trigger, and the calm waters of the Pacific would ignite into global fire. This was not simply navigation. It was a test of nerves, pride, and the endurance of two rival powers staring each other down. Why did an American warship choose to appear at this exact moment? Why did it broadcast its position openly on the very day China celebrated the founding of its navy? And was this move a carefully planned political message aimed directly at Beijing's military pride? Let's find out with WarFleet. On April 23, 2025, the guided missile destroyer USS William P. Lawrence DDG-110, an Arleigh Burke-class vessel armed with the Aegis combat system, sliced through the Taiwan Strait. Yet this was no silent transit. Instead of masking its position, the destroyer kept its AIS transponder switched on, making its every move visible to global tracking systems. What could have been routine navigation became deliberate theater. The date sharpened the impact. April 23rd is PLA Navy Day, when Beijing celebrates the strength and legacy of its maritime force. By appearing openly on that precise day, Washington ensured the operation struck at the symbolic core of Chinese naval pride. Nor was this an isolated gesture. According to Reuters, US 9 News, and analysts at the Center for Naval Analyses, it was already the second US transit of 2025. Rhythm matters in strategy. One passage might be coincidence. A second, staged on a day of national symbolism, becomes a clear narrative of intent. The message was unmistakable. Freedom of navigation is non-negotiable. Even when the calendar belongs to Beijing, the strait remains international waters. By choosing visibility over discretion, Washington signaled resolve not only to China, but to allies and observers worldwide. Washington was signaling that freedom of navigation remained non-negotiable, even on dates of symbolic importance to Beijing. The result was clear. Beijing could not ignore a US destroyer slicing openly through the Taiwan Strait on its own Navy Day. Within hours, Chinese planners scrambled to prepare a counter. For the Communist Party, silence would mean humiliation. At the center of the storm stood the USS William P. Lawrence DDG-110, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer bristling with the Aegis combat system. By choosing a single destroyer rather than an entire carrier strike group, Washington struck a deliberate balance. Strength without over-escalation. Enough firepower to hold the line, but not so much as to trigger a regional crisis. The regional backdrop made the move sharper still. In early 2025, Beijing had ramped up military drills around Taiwan and imposed new rules demanding that foreign vessels report when entering waters it claimed as its own. The April 23rd transit was more than symbolism. It was a direct challenge to those rules, a refusal to let Chinese bureaucracy redraw international law. For Washington, the objectives were layered. It was about reinforcing freedom of navigation operations, FONOPS, proving that international sea lanes remained open. It was about reassuring allies in Tokyo and Manila that American resolve was intact. And it was about showing that US deterrence would not bend to a manufactured calendar. Beijing's response was swift and emotional. State media thundered about a serious provocation. Nationalist commentators demanded retaliation. Warships began to reposition. Fighters scrambled. What started as a transit now ignited the opening sparks of escalation, underscoring how weak deterrence from the White House allows small tactical encounters to evolve into strategic crises. From here, China could not look the other way, and its military reaction came quickly. Radar operators at a coastal base, barely 85 kilometers from the strait, gave the order. Sirens wailed, engines roared. Within minutes, two J-16 multi-role fighters clawed into the sky. Their afterburners carved white scars across the clouds as they turned directly toward the American destroyer. The launch was no accident. It was timed, deliberate, and designed for maximum visibility. Beijing wanted everyone to see the response. Sailors on the USS William P. Lawrence, satellites overhead, and audiences glued to state media at home. The message was clear. U.S. warships would never pass through what China claimed as its waters unnoticed, least of all on PLA Navy Day. Allowing a silent transit would have been humiliation. Scrambling fighters transformed it into spectacle. Yet the purpose was not to fight. The J-16S carried no orders to strike. Their mission was shadowing, intimidation, signaling. This set the stage for an encounter that was more about political signaling than combat. The real surprise was not the scramble itself, but the weapons carried by the J-16. As the fighters closed in, analysts watching their loadouts noticed a striking absence. No anti-ship missiles hung beneath their wings. Instead, the pylons carried only air-to-air weapons, the PL-10 and the PL-15. The PL-10, a short-range dogfighting missile, is China's answer to the American AIM-9X. Agile, infrared-guided, and lethal in close combat, it gives the J-16 teeth in a turning fight. The PL-15, by contrast, reaches far beyond the horizon. With an active radar seeker and a range exceeding 200 kilometers, it is designed to push high-value targets, AWACS, patrol aircraft, or refuelers, out of contested skies. Together, the two missiles offered flexibility, dominance at knife fight range, or strikes at standoff distance. The absence of anti-ship armament sent a deliberate signal. Beijing was not preparing to sink the USS William P. Lawrence. Instead, it was declaring control of the skies above the strait. The message was sovereignty, not destruction. This was graduated signaling, measured escalation calibrated for maximum political effect without triggering open war. A show of force that said, "We own the air here, just as we claim the sea." On People's Liberation Army Navy Day, the symbolism was powerful, a reminder to the world that China considered itself both guardian of the sea and master of the sky. But even symbolic actions carry danger. The Taiwan Strait is narrow, crowded, and unforgiving. When armed fighters fly within striking distance of a U.S. destroyer, the margin for error shrinks to seconds. A radar lock misread as intent to fire, a sudden maneuver mistaken for an attack, even a flare deployed at the wrong moment, any could trigger a deadly spiral. Aboard the USS William P. Lawrence, sailors tracked every move through the Aegis combat system. Consoles glowed, antennas hummed, and the SPY-1 radar painted the sky in relentless sweeps. Farther out, American P-8A patrol aircraft circled, collecting every electronic pulse and every maneuver for intelligence archives in Washington. Nothing in the encounter went unrecorded. Yet Beijing was not merely flexing at sea. By arming the J-16s exclusively with air-to-air missiles, China extended its claim from water to air, presenting itself as guardian of both domains. The symbolism resonated. At home, the intercept fed nationalist pride. For U.S. allies in Tokyo and Manila, it underscored China's readiness to escalate. For Washington, it highlighted the fragility of so-called routine operations in contested waters. And here lay the paradox. Every close pass, every radar ping, every missile profile lit up under American sensors. What was meant to intimidate instead provided the United States with a data harvest, emission signatures, missile configurations, pilot tactics. Beijing tried to project confidence, but in doing so, it revealed pieces of its hand. From here, China's symbolism would not be enough. To prove true strength, it would soon have to confront U.S. technology head-on. When the J-16 fighters closed in on the USS William P. Lawrence, the encounter shifted from political theater to a battle of technology. No missiles launched, no guns fired, but both sides locked horns in silence. An invisible duel where radars, sensors, and algorithms became weapons. At the heart of the American destroyer pulsed the Aegis combat system, a network of sensors and fire control processors designed for layered defense. Its core was the SPY-1 phased array radar, a massive set of panels mounted high on the superstructure. With a range stretching beyond 250 nautical miles, it could track hundreds of airborne objects simultaneously, from fighters and drones to ballistic arcs skimming the upper atmosphere. Every sweep added new layers of information: altitude, vector, speed, emissions. For the sailors at their consoles, it was a digital map of the battle space, alive and shifting by the second. Confidence came not from guesswork, but from integration. Sonar, comms, missile batteries, all feeding back into Aegis, all speaking the same language of war. Yet the Chinese pilots were far from blind. Each J-16 carried an AESA radar, agile and adaptive, capable of hopping frequencies in microseconds to resist jamming. Instead of presenting a steady signal, it painted targets in pulses designed to confuse and evade. Hanging beneath their wings, electronic countermeasure pods whined softly, projecting false echoes meant to distort the SPY-1's picture. Meanwhile, optical sensors captured imagery even without radar emissions, ensuring the fighters could map the American destroyer through sight as well as spectrum. This was not bluffing. It was reconnaissance under the guise of interception. Washington wanted to measure Chinese radar performance. How quickly did the AESA lock onto surface targets? How resilient was it to electronic noise? At the same time, Beijing wanted to probe Aegis. How fast would the SPY-1 detect? At what range did the system shift from surveillance to fire control mode? Every second in proximity produced data points. Every emission was a breadcrumb of capability, but the line between observation and escalation was razor-thin. In naval doctrine, a radar lock can be interpreted as preparation to fire. A sudden shift to fire control frequencies could justify immediate defensive action. That tension created a knife-edge balance. The William P. Lawrence tracked the J-16s continuously, but commanders withheld the switch to engagement mode. Chinese pilots pressed closer, enough to show defiance, but stopped short of maneuvers that might trigger counterfire. Both sides danced on the edge of the red line, daring the other to flinch. For the Americans, the dual validated training, disciplined restraint under pressure, silent confidence in their system. For the Chinese, the reward was psychological as well as technical, flying boldly near a U.S. destroyer, refusing to yield, while recording valuable electronic signatures. Neither side sought a missile exchange. The real victory was information, and in that shadow war, data equaled power. The U.S. logged Chinese radar modes, ECM signatures, and pilot tactics, each file feeding into intelligence archives, each waveform becoming a future countermeasure. China returned with its own prize: the rhythm of Aegis detection, the discipline of American crews, the invisible habits of a destroyer under pressure. What looked like a tense encounter was in fact a harvest. No smoke, no fire, yet both sides walked away with ammunition measured in knowledge. Because in 21st century conflict, secrets are as deadly as steel. Every intercept serves both as a message and a test, part of a larger struggle fought in the electromagnetic spectrum as much as on the sea. As the radar duel continued, the encounter escalated into a physical and psychological showdown. One J-16 suddenly broke formation, its twin engines howling as it rocketed upward, climbing past 20,000 feet in seconds. For a heartbeat, it vanished into the thin cloud layer, then rolled inverted, nose down. Afterburners flaring, the fighter plunged almost vertically toward the USS William P. Lawrence. Sailors on deck watched the silhouette grow larger, a streak of steel and fire tearing through the sky. At the last possible moment, the J-16 leveled off, skimming only 150 meters above the waves, before charging directly at the destroyer in a mock attack run. The maneuver was reckless, bordering on suicidal. One slight miscalculation, a slip of the stick, a delayed pull, could have ended in catastrophe. More dangerous still, the American crew could have misread the dive as hostile intent, triggering phalanx guns or missile intercepts. But the Chinese pilot pressed on, gambling on discipline over panic. For Beijing, the spectacle was defiance on PLA Navy Day. For the Americans, it was a nerve-shattering test, a reminder that even without missiles or bombs, intimidation itself could be wielded as a weapon. The tension did not end there. Just as the destroyer steadied after the mock dive, another pair of J-16s swept in from different bearings. Their formation widened, one banking left, the other right, until the USS William P. Lawrence found itself caught in a classic bracket maneuver. For fighter pilots, bracketing is a trap, forcing an opponent to split focus, caught between two converging predators. Against a warship, the tactic became something more insidious. Pressure without fire. The SPY-1 radar now had to paint both jets at once, dividing its beams, calculating altitude, angles, acceleration. Sailors inside the combat center felt the weight of every decision. Which jet carried the greater risk? Which vector would suddenly transform into another dive? Or would both plunge together, overwhelming human judgment in seconds? The destroyer's steel bulkheads vibrated faintly as engines screamed overhead. The deck trembled as shockwaves rolled across the hull. Boots shuffled, eyes darted, voices tightened into clipped commands. Even the steady hum of electronics seemed louder, amplified by the nerves of men and women who knew that one wrong keystroke could trigger war. Fatigue and tension built layer by layer, not from explosions, but from anticipation. It was psychological attrition, war measured in heartbeats, not casualties. For Beijing, the maneuver was deliberate symbolism. In 2001, an overzealous J-8 collided with a USEP-3 near Hainan, triggering a major diplomatic crisis. The memory lingered in both navies. The April 2025 bracketing carried echoes of that event, a warning that accidents were never far from deliberate risk-taking. To Chinese audiences, the message was dominance. We can box in the Americans at will. For Washington, the trial was discipline forged in doctrine. Restraint became a weapon. The Americans held their fire control modes in reserve, tracked steadily, and let training override fear. The challenge was resisting the urge to escalate, to remember that composure was as decisive as firepower. Victory was ambiguous yet undeniable. The U.S. prevailed by not cracking under pressure, relying on procedure and technology. China prevailed by pressing dangerously close without losing control. Each side framed the moment as success, but the true battlefield was unseen. The nerves of sailors, the resolve of pilots, the silence between decisions. Modern conflict often begins not with salvos of missiles, but with battles in the mind. The bracket maneuver proved it. 2 jets, 1 ship, no shots fired, yet the psychological clash was as sharp as steel. Both sides discovered that in modern conflict, the fight often begins not with missiles, but in the mind of the opponent. And as the psychological pressure peaked, escalation was unavoidable. What had begun with probing radars and aggressive flybys now transformed into a full encirclement. The People's Liberation Army widened the stage, adding more fighters to the skies while sending in a warship to shadow the American destroyer. The air grew thick with contrails. Additional J-16s thundered into the strait, weaving above and around the USS William P. Lawrence. Each new arrival tightened the noose, forcing the SPY-1 radar operators to expand their tracking grid until the screen bloomed with targets. Above, the sky swarmed with noise and speed. Below, a darker shape cut across the horizon. Closing fast was a Type 05 2D destroyer, China's answer to the Arleigh Burke class. With vertical launch systems bristling on deck, advanced radar arrays sweeping the air, and long-range missiles in its cells, the 05 2D represented a naval power statement. We can mirror you ship for ship. For the crew of the William P. Lawrence, the effect was suffocating. Pressure now came from 2 fronts. Jets screamed overhead in aggressive passes, while the shadowing destroyer tracked them relentlessly from the sea. The sense of being trapped seeped into every corridor, a siege without shots. Conversation in the combat center grew terse, clipped. Eyes stayed locked on monitors, hands hovered above controls, every sailor silently weighing the cost of a wrong decision. Then came the shocks. 1 J-16 dropped to barely 36 meters above the waves and tore across the American ship's beam, so low that sailors on deck could see the pilot's helmet glinting in the sun. A heartbeat later, another fighter screamed directly over the deck at supersonic speed. The sonic booms slammed into the destroyer, rattling bulkheads, shaking consoles, and sending a violent shudder through every steel joint. For a split second, it felt like the opening of an attack. To Beijing's domestic audience, these maneuvers would later be framed as courage, proof that Chinese pilots had forced an American destroyer to endure humiliation on People's Liberation Army Navy Day. To Washington, they looked like deliberate provocations, reckless gambles that violated international aviation standards and brought the world inches from crisis. The PLA was willing to push the confrontation right to the edge of disaster for the sake of political theater. And in that moment, Beijing revealed its readiness to create danger, not as accident, but as strategy. The maneuvers revealed Beijing's willingness to create danger for political theater, pushing the encounter right to the edge of disaster. For Beijing, the purpose was clear. The mock dives, the supersonic passes, the low-altitude harassment, all were staged to humiliate the U.S. Navy in contested waters on PLA Navy Day. State media would broadcast images of roaring J-16 and a shadowing destroyer, packaging the encounter as proof of Chinese resolve. At home, the narrative would be simple. China forced an American warship to endure intimidation. But to Washington, the meaning was different. The maneuvers exposed how far Beijing was willing to go to manufacture risk. By creating unsafe conditions, the PLA raised the chance of accident, miscalculation, or collision, events that could spiral far beyond the Taiwan Strait. For U.S. commanders, the lesson was sharp. China was prepared to gamble with stability for propaganda gain. The decisive factor, however, was not China's aggression, but America's restraint. Inside the Combat Information Center of the William P. Lawrence, sailors kept their stations. No defensive missiles were armed. No phalanx CIWS spun into action. No countermaneuvers were ordered. Turrets tracked silently, but fingers stayed off triggers. Restraint here was not weakness, it was discipline. Every sailor stood seconds away from battle, yet none crossed the line. In holding fire, the crew turned self-control into a weapon as potent as any missile. The encounter became proof that the strength of the U.S. Navy rests not only in steel and electronics, but in the human ability to stay calm under storm. Because in the end, what mattered most was not China's theatrics, but America's ability to remain calm in the storm. In the middle of the encirclement, the USS William P. Lawrence remained calm yet fully armed. The destroyer's SPY-1 radar swept ceaselessly, feeding every blip, altitude, and bearing into the Aegis combat system. The command center's screens glowed with a living map of threats. J-16S circling above, a Type 052D destroyer closing from the sea. Nothing moved without being cataloged, tracked, and measured. On deck, the most visible symbol of readiness loomed quietly. The Phalanx CYWS, its 6-barrel Gatling cannon, capable of spitting 4,000 rounds per minute, pivoted in silence. In automatic mode, it could have torn any diving aircraft from the sky in seconds. Alongside it, other turrets rotated smoothly, their steel muzzles aligned on invisible arcs of fire. From a tactical perspective, the William P. Lawrence was far from helpless prey. Any reckless move could have been answered with overwhelming force, yet the weapon stayed silent. The reason lay not in weakness, but in rules of engagement. Firing first would have handed Beijing a propaganda victory and risked transforming theater into war. American commanders understood the trap. Discipline was the shield. Restraint was the strategy. For the sailors, the tension was crushing. Every vibration of the hull, every radar ping, every shadow of a passing jet gnawed at their nerves. Even so, voices in the combat center stayed calm, clipped, professional. Training became oxygen, keeping panic at bay. They knew the destroyer was surrounded, yet they also trusted the doctrine drilled into them. Hold steady, never escalate without cause. This calm defiance carried a message far beyond the strait. Allies in Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila would see not panic but professionalism. Adversaries would see resolve without recklessness. Active radars glowing, CIWS turrets tracking, missiles primed but unfired. The posture itself radiated deterrence. The sight alone was enough to remind the PLA that the American destroyer was no defenseless target, but a fortress of steel, patience, and discipline. This calm response also robbed China of the spectacle it wanted. The flybys, the mock dives, the sonic booms. Each maneuver was choreographed to provoke panic on PLA Navy Day. Yet the crew of the USS William P. refused to give Beijing the image it craved. No frantic movements, no defensive fire, only steady hands guiding the ship through contested waters. What emerged instead was an image of professionalism. Screens glowing, weapons tracking, sailors unshaken. The destroyer pressed on with its course. To allies in Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila, that image mattered as much as missiles. It signaled that the United States could withstand pressure without flinching, offering reassurance that discipline still anchored American power in the Indo-Pacific. More than that, restraint prevented a spark that could have dragged multiple nations into conflict. Washington proved that strength is not only measured in firepower, but also in the ability to control escalation. China had tried to intimidate through sonic booms and low passes, but the United States answered with something stronger: the discipline to deter without firing a shot. And because the American crew held steady, the tense drama finally reached its conclusion. After nearly an hour of standoff, the Chinese J-16S pulled their throttles high and climbed away, vanishing into the clouds. The Type 052D destroyer adjusted course, sliding into a parallel track at a safe distance. The circle around the USS William P. loosened, but the message remained etched into the waters of the Taiwan Strait. This was no retreat. It was the calculated end of a carefully staged confrontation. Beijing had already achieved its objectives. It demonstrated air and sea encirclement, showcased strength on PLA Navy Day, and proved it could harass a U.S. destroyer without firing a shot. The closing signal was sharp. We control this space. We can pressure you at will. And because we chose not to pull the trigger, escalation did not begin. It was a warning dressed as restraint, a signal that China would continue to test boundaries. For Washington, the encounter served as a stark reminder that great power competition now unfolds in moments where even a radar lock or a low-altitude pass can decide the fragile line between political deterrence and open conflict. The Taiwan Strait episode proved that peace is not the absence of confrontation. It is the discipline to prevent escalation when provocation rises. Every maneuver, every radar sweep, every decision aboard the USS William P. carried lessons beyond tactics. China sought to intimidate through spectacle, but the United States demonstrated that control under pressure is itself a weapon. Allies saw reassurance, adversaries saw restraint, and the world saw how close miscalculation can bring nations to the brink. At WarFleet, our mission is to reveal these realities, to educate and expose the thin boundary between deterrence and escalation. If you value knowledge that bridges the gap between war and peace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to WarFleet, and share it with others. Because the